You can't replace part of the brain. Like, you
treat them the same.
The source of truth for the medtech industry.
Coexists with the province.
Robot understands things automatically.
Number one show in the medtech industry.
So Stryker got ahead of that and changed in the 90s, built $1 billion company that held up high, a lot of things.
State of MedTech.
With your host, Omar and Khateeb. What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the show. So today's solo pod is more of a, honoring a legendary figure in our industry, but also talking about the history of this company. And that figure is Leon Hirsch, who tragically passed away a few months ago. Many of you saw it on LinkedIn. And Leon was the founder and chairman of US Surgical, which is one of the most historic companies in our industry because of a lot of things that they did in terms of how they trained and commercialized product. And if you look at, you can call it a coaching tree, so many executives in this industry came from US Surgical, and now they sit as CEOs and really high-ranking execs. Many of them are even board members at other companies. And so I wanted to cover, one is, Leon's story, to share a little bit more about it, but also really go through the history of US Surgical, both the good and the bad, so you can understand what was the story behind that company. And I think it's really important for us to understand and know these things. One thing I always say is that, if you look at our customers, which are physicians, they are very well versed and appreciate this history of surgery. And so for us as medtech professionals, we have to understand our own history. And so first, I want to read from Leon Hirsch's obituary, so you have a nice synopsis of his background. Right. So Leon Hirsch was born on July 20th, 1927. He passed away on December 10th, 2023, is a pioneering American business executive and the founder of United States Surgical Corp, or USSC, and he passed away at the age of 96. So he was born in the Bronx, New York, to Isidore and Rosalind Hirsch, and his life was marked by innovation, dedication, and a profound impact on medical technology. Now, in 1963, he founded US Surgical, which was a Connecticut-based medical technology company. And he was the founder, chairman, and CEO of US Surgical, providing surgical products to healthcare professionals in 90 countries worldwide, which later sold to Tyco International in 1998. Hirsch is celebrated as the inventor of the modern-day surgical stapler. And under his leadership, US Surgical revolutionized surgery and was the largest manufacturer of surgical staplers and laparoscopic instruments. Hirsch and the U.S. Surgical legacy lies in its significant contributions to the field of surgery, particularly minimally invasive techniques. Their innovations in surgical equipment have had a lasting impact on the medical field, improving the safety and effectiveness of surgical procedures worldwide. And then today, as it's evolved, Covidien/US Surgical continues to lead in medical research and development. Okay. A couple other things. So Vivitone hearing aids technology. So in 2003, Hirsch once more transformed a segment of healthcare with the introduction of Vivitone, a first-in-class open-fit receiver-in-the-ear hearing aid system. And for Hirsch, it was a personal experience that led to what he considered his third medical revolution. Today, almost every hearing aid manufacturer offers a hearing aid that incorporates the open fit concept and technology. Finally, Leon dedicated his life to medical device industry by showing the world new pathways to the future. Throughout his professional career, Hirsch has applied a working philosophy of commitment to excellence. Through hard work, determination, and creativity, Hirsch built a successful corporation from the ground up and created an institution culture with a life of its own. Today, as I mentioned before, you will find former U.S. Surgical alumni throughout the globe, many with CEO titles, other with senior management positions, and many more designing, manufacturing, and marketing the finest innovative devices in the industry. Every single one proud to be a former U.S. Surgical employee. And this is very true. And finally, just a little, just to honor his family. So Lee's most cherished asset was his family, which remained the focal point of his life to the end. He's survived by his wife, Fanny Flesher Hirsch, and his children, Tom, Susan, Rick, Alex, Max, and Annie. He's also survived by his daughter-in-law, Anna, grandchildren, Dacia, Andy, Jessica, Nick, Jackie, Ryan, Matt, Will, Jack, and 2 great-grandchildren, Alexis and Elliot. So now that you know a little bit about the man, let's get into the details of U.S. surgical's history, both good and bad. And specifically, I'm using the American Encyclopedia, who's kind of done a really good job detailing the chronology and history of U.S. surgical. Now, for those of you who might be interested to hear directly from Leon Hirsch, I wish I was able to get him on my show, but I think by the time I had reached out, he had already passed, or hey, at least I think he was quite ill when I reached out. I think in August. Yeah, so I reached out in August. He was already quite ill, so unfortunately, it wasn't going to happen. But Joe Mullings, the founder of the Mullings Group, actually had a really fantastic interview with him a few years ago where he went to his home. You can look that up on YouTube. Just type in Leon Hirsch and it'll be the first thing that comes up. Now, let's get into the history of one of the most historic companies in our industry. So, United States Surgical Corporation was a leading producer of tools used in surgery, and that includes sutures, staplers, laparoscopic instruments, cardiovascular surgical products, and electrosurgical devices. So, as mentioned, it was founded in the 1960s by an entrepreneur, Leon Hirsch, who had no background in medicine, but had an idea about how to use staples in surgery and pioneered the development of this market in the U.S. Okay, by the late 80s, U.S. Surgical introduced another innovation in surgical techniques when it began to market tubes and other devices that allowed operations that were far less invasive than conventional procedures. This was kind of the birth of minimally invasive surgery. On the strength of this new technique, the company's fortunes really soared in the 1990s, but were deflated in the mid-1990s as uncertainty in the healthcare industry as a whole starts to set in, and then under increasing pressure from competitors, U.S. Surgical agreed to be bought by Tyco in 1998 and became a subsidiary of the Bermuda-based conglomerate. Okay, now let's go back to where this all started. So the origins of the surgical stapler. So U.S. Surgical was founded in 1964 by the late Leon Hirsch, who is the owner of a small and not so successful dry cleaning equipment business. He literally ran a dry cleaning business. He only had a high school education, but nevertheless, Hirsch had a very strong and avid interest in like gadgets and biology. He was always fascinated by that. And he often stopped by the office of a patent broker in New York City, which is where he lived, just to see what was around. And I think this is the first hallmark of a great entrepreneur, is like this idea of curiosity. One thing that I learned watching Leon Hirsch's interviews was that when he talks about entrepreneurship, he's like, you can't teach it. You know, like there's literally like opportunities everywhere, just like air. And so you can't really teach somebody that, right? And so Hirsch would constantly have this creative bug in him where he's just curious, okay? So one day in spring 1963, he came across this like wooden device on this man's desk that, you know, looked like he didn't know what it was. It just very interesting. And so he picked this up and he said, sir, you know, what is this? What's this mystery object? And so this gentleman who worked at the patent office said that this object was used by doctors in Hungary and Russia to make stitches. So instead of using like silk thread, this was like a stapler. And you know, and eventually was used in the United States. So the surgical stapler, as it was known, had been the first thing that was invented in Hungary, first invented in Hungary in 1908, at the time when many surgery patients pretty much died of infection from contamination of their wounds. With the stapler, an area inside of the body could essentially be clamped off before any cutting was done, which dramatically reduced the loss of blood and other fluids. The problem though, was that the stapler was extremely cumbersome to use and really time consuming. And when you listen to Leon Hirsch describe it, you know, his thing was like back then when they would use a surgical stapler, these staples were literally the size of 2 hairs put together. And so a nurse had to literally put on eyeglasses or magnifying glasses to load the cartridges up in surgery. And so most American nurses had no interest nor the time to do that, right? And just to give you an idea, it took 2 hours to assemble, and a second person had to feed the individual stainless steel staplers into it with tweezers in order for a surgeon to use it. And so Hirsch looked at the stapler and he had the inspiration that a disposable cartridge of staples would simplify the instrument's use enormously. What he did, he asked this gentleman, he's like, can I take this home with me and play around with it and see? And he's like, yeah. He's like, here's a stapler, and then here's the selling guide from the Russians. Like, we don't really have any use for it. And so Hirsch takes this home, goes to his basement of his house, and starts playing around, and then essentially using, I think, balsa wood, came up with a prototype cartridge stapler. Yeah, out of balsa wood. And then he spent $75,000 of his own savings to have a metal version of this model made, which is unbelievable. And he goes back and it's like, and his idea behind this was like, this is like a razor blade model, right? You have the razor, you have the razor blades. Why not do this all at the factory and put them in the cartridges and sell this to the clinician? Okay. This was in my opinion, and again, maybe I'm wrong because this is not very well documented. I think this is the very first time in our industry where someone came up with this concept of the razor blade model. That came from U.S. Surgical. If somebody has any information to debate that, please let me know. Okay. So then Hirsch, so think about how crazy that is. This guy was, I think, I don't know, maybe in his late 20s, early 30s when he decided to do this in the 60s was $75,000. And so if we calculate that, $75,000 in 1964 is how much today? That's essentially $713,000 in today's numbers, okay? And look, even today, just think of that. If you were just a regular guy, you had a little business, $75,000 today is still a lot of money. Back then, that was an insane amount of money. Like that's the money you retire on. So he bet his life on this pretty much. So then he took the stapler, reached out to two surgeons at Johns Hopkins Medical School in Baltimore to test a new device. And on the basis of their strong recommendation, right, he was able to line up $2 million in financing from two investors to develop and market the product, right? And, a lot of this started with Hirsch, doing some research and speaking to surgeons to understand like why was it cumbersome and like can this actually be used, right? And the big thing that he got was like, yeah, this solves a problem, in the marketplace. The issue is that it was just too hard to use, and I think that's one of the most important things when you develop a new product, new technology or service, whatever it is as an entrepreneur, which is look for things that are real problems. Develop a painkiller, not a vitamin, something that's a need to have, right? Not nice to have. Okay. And so in 1964, he incorporated U.S. Surgical with 4 employees. And from 1964 to 67, Hirsch and his partners worked to refine the prototype and develop a variety of surgical instruments. They made this effort so that they would be able to spread the costs of their marketing activities among a number of different products. Okay. Then in 1967, U.S. Surgical finally began to sell its products, distributing them through wholesalers of surgical supplies. The company's main product, the surgical stapler that Hirsch had first developed, looked like a stainless steel wrench. Okay. And I can confirm that because it definitely looks like a stainless steel wrench. And so let me go back here. If I can describe it, it had a hooked end slot for a staple cartridge. And so a surgeon placed the hook at the end around the area that's going to be closed, tighten the clamp, and then pull the trigger to insert the stapler. And then with this device, blood loss and injury tissue was minimized, and the time spent in surgery was sharply reduced. So it was a big breakthrough. The device was used primarily in abdominal and thoracic surgery when it was originally introduced. So in the first 2 years, U.S. Surgical successfully sold staplers to a large number of surgeons. In 1967, sales totaled about $350,000. By 1969, the company's sales had reached $1 million. The company, however, also racked up $1 million worth of losses. What happened was surgeons were buying the stapler, but they were not using it. Okay. And so U.S. Surgical had counted on making its money from the sale of the staple cartridges, which were disposables and had to be purchased again and again, right? So when the company found that surgeons were instinctively cautious and conservative in the operating room, reverting in an operation to the techniques they knew best, right, and been trained on, right, only those surgeons who had been trained personally in the operating by one of Hirsch's employees made the switch to use the stapler. Okay. And so US Surgical tried a number of different solutions to the problem of how to combine sales with training. Okay. And this is another big innovation for US Surgical. Leon Hirsch and US Surgical are technically the company that pioneered this idea that we should have our own training program where salespeople are trained clinically so that not only they can sell the product, but they can also service and support the customer in the OR to drive customer success. And if you think about that, for us, this is like, it's like common sense today, but this common sense was literally developed by Leon Hirsch and US Surgical. This was unheard of, okay? And what I love about that is that it shows that they innovated internally around their commercial processes. So first, Hirsch had, I think, like 8 or 10 nurses who were hired to as technical instructors. They trained surgeons on the use of staplers in the operating room. But the problem with this is that when you hire nurses to do this, it's very practical, but it's very, very expensive. So then Hirsch moved from that. That didn't work as well. It was really expensive. Moved from that to hiring medics and paramedics, leaving the Army, and asked them to sell the stapler and to train surgeons. Now, although they had a sound medical background, Hirsch found that they were really bad salespeople. And then finally, in 1972, US Surgical hit upon the solution of hiring experienced salespeople and then giving them medical training. Okay. The company developed a 240-hour course that covered many aspects of basic medicine, which was supplemented by 40 hours of training in the animal laboratory where the surgery was actually done, right? So overall, and again, so think about how crazy this is. 1972, we're talking about more or less, at least according to Hirsch, this is a 6-week course, and it cost each salesperson, it costs to train them $8,000 for each salesperson, okay? So that's an investment, right? And so how do you protect that investment? Well, to motivate the sales force, okay, the company paid no regular salaries to salespeople, but only commissions, and dismissed employees quickly if they failed to perform well. Plus, in the training program, you don't get hired until after the training. The offer letter you received was subject to, meaning that they had to go through training and pass it before they were hired, which will explain for some of you who maybe have worked at Intuitive in the early to mid 2000s, or maybe worked at a company run by former Intuitive leadership, many of whom came from US Surgical. This is why our training is so rigorous. And again, the training that I went through at Mazor Robotics, again, led by former Intuitive surgical employees who many of whom started their career at US Surgical. This is why it's so rigorous. So by the late 1970s, okay, so think about this. We have you have a really expensive, intensive 6-week training program that if you didn't get through, you got fired. Okay. And then afterwards, you were not paid a salary, you're just given commission. And if you did not perform, you got cut. So when you put that all in a pressure cooker, this creates a really high pressure corporate culture. And this drove US Surgical sales literally to new heights. Okay. And this allowed them to grow rapidly from a baseline of 20,000 patients who had operations with staplers in 1969. The company's market growth, their market had grown to 700,000 patients. In addition, the company had also expanded its operations in Europe, training sales reps to begin introducing staples to the market. At this time, however, right, this is where clouds started to appear on the horizon. As US Surgical contracted out its manufacturing when demand for its product grew, the company's standards of quality started to slip. Okay. And again, please, you got to keep in mind that we're talking about the 70s and 80s. And so what we see in terms of supply chain and everything now, this was not common back then. So when you start scaling, these things happen. Today it happens, right? So to ameliorate this problem, US Surgical began to build new factories of its products in Puerto Rico and North Haven, Connecticut. Okay. So now we're going to go from into the late 1970s and 80s where there's increased competition. And again, this is a history, allegations of different practices, right? So for many years, US Surgical had the surgical staple market pretty much to itself. And in 1977, though, one of its main competitors, Johnson & Johnson's Ethicon division, entered the surgical staple market with a disposable staple, right? Which by doing that, it eliminated the need for the costly cleaning and maintenance of the reusable stapler, okay? The Ethicon stapler immediately became very popular and temporarily captured a large portion of U.S. Surgical's external wound closure market, okay? Now, what does U.S. Surgical do, okay? To counter this threat, U.S. Surgical launched a 4-year, $100 million development program to make up for lost ground. The company announced that it would market its own disposable stapler and that it would also move into new areas of medical supplies, such as intravenous feeding sets, electronic vital signs monitors. These new products would have their own sales force, okay? So moving more into the capital equipment side. Plus, in 1977, U.S. Surgical decided to replace its network of independent distributors with its own operations. So in response, one of its unemployed distributors moved to Australia and set up a competitor to U.S. Surgical called Hospital Products, Inc., which began to market very similar products in the United States and Australia. So U.S. Surgical respond by suing the living hell out of Hospital Products, Inc. For a variety of infractions, which included patent violations and misrepresentation. Hospital Products responded with a legal action of its own, charging unfair competition and antitrust violations, and a cluster of lawsuits provoking a frenzy of backbiting and name-calling that went on as legal actions dragged out into the mid-1980s. Now, when lawsuits and stuff like this are happening now, it's really intense. I got to tell you, if you read any books on corporate culture and sales from the 70s and 80s, it's brutal. I just feel like it was way more brutal back then for some reason. Now, despite its rapid growth in the 1970s, U.S. Surgical allegedly began in 1979 to engage in a series of illegal practices that were designed to inflate its sales figure. Again, this is allegedly, and again, I'm just covering a history of U.S. Surgical, all right? So as the SEC later claimed, the company used, some fraudulent accounting practices and shipped faked or non-existent orders to pump up its sales figures. So then in 1981, U.S. Surgical claimed profits of $12.9 million when in fact the SEC calculated it only earned $200,000, right? 1984, under pressure from the SEC, U.S. Surgical agreed without admitting or denying charges to cut its earnings and claims by a total of $26 million for the years of 1979 to 82, and some of its managers agreed to give back bonuses they had earned, in earlier years, okay? Now, in addition, and by the way, I'm only covering this because these are the kind of turbulent things that happen when you're taking a company back, even now, but especially back in those days where it was kind of the Wild West, right? So in addition, U.S. Surgical was charged with a variety of illicit sales practice, all of which pointed to an atmosphere of extreme pressure within the company itself. So again, designing this training program, again, when you get diamonds from that much pressure, you're going to end up with a lot of other things as well. Okay, we've seen this at Intuitive. We've seen this at a lot of different companies. So salespeople, started to complain that they are forced to encourage to dump USC products on hospitals and engage in a number of, variable practices such as hiding products, stealing them, wasting them, writing phony orders, adding zeros to numbers on order forms, and then sending back products that had not been ordered and then refusing to take them back. And again, this is where in the 80s, these kind of practices happened in hospitals because there really weren't any laws dictating this. So you're dealing with extremely intense selling environments. You're dealing with really rigorous and intense competition, people trying to steal patents from you, steal sales. So it was just mayhem back then. So in 1980, in response to the complaints from hospitals about overshipment, U.S. Surgical revamped its sales management and fired 20 employees. And in 1983, the company also moved to reduce its pressure on sales force by changing the structure of its payment from 100% commission on increase in sales to half salary. Okay. And again, really, really interesting. On the company perspective, right? U.S. Surgical said that as we begin a new decade of innovation, U.S. Surgical continues to expand through internal development and strategic acquisitions. Numerous technological breakthroughs and product innovations are providing a platform for growth. We're proud of our work ethic and culture dedicated to exceeding customer expectation. Here to help is a cornerstone of our culture. Every employee here is here to either help advance patient care and or to customize solutions that meet the specific needs of our customers. So Despite these difficulties, by 1982, U.S. surgical sales had risen to $160 million. Pretty impressive. Although the company's growth slowed in the following year as cost-conscious hospitals started to cut back on inventory, the company's sales nonetheless rose to $180 million. And then by 1984, the U.S. Surgical controlled 90% of internal surgical staples and the majority of the market for external skin staplers. So think about that. This guy with a high school education bets the farm and his life savings, $75,000 in the early 1960s, to take some patent on a Russian stapler, bring it to market, came up with the razor blade model for cartridges that our industry is built on, and in a couple of decades rose up to own 90% of the market for internal surgical staplers. This is why Leon Hirsch is considered, and I can say that he is a titan of our industry. So U.S. Surgical had diversified its product line to include 13 more products in 1981, and then in 1984, it introduced a new technological breakthrough, absorbable staples. Okay, really impressive, right? Which made staple removal pretty much unnecessary. And while absorbable suture thread had existed for years, the company's new product introduced the quality to stapler procedure. In the mid-1980s, U.S. Surgical also embarked on a program to enter the suture market. Then in 1987, the company won a ruling from the FDA to streamline the process of approval for new suture materials, and it announced plans to introduce its suture materials by the early 1990s. U.S. Surgical then entered the suture market in 1991. Now, let's talk about the late 1980s and early 1990s. Subheadline: skyrocketing fortunes from laparoscopic devices. By far, the most important development of 1987 for U.S. Surgical was the introduction of the Surgiport trocar, a disposable tube-like device through which other surgical instruments were inserted into the body. AKA, this is the introduction and start of minimally invasive surgery, my friends. The company had purchased exclusive rights to its technology from a company called Endotherapeutics. I don't know why I had that dash in the previous year. This gadget eventually opened the door for laparoscopic surgery, in which very small incisions were made in the body so that a camera could be inserted, enabling a surgeon to operate using instruments channeled through narrow tubes. This technique reduced the need for large incisions, which required long periods of recovery for the patient. Then in the late 1980s, U.S. Surgical came under fire from an animal rights activist for its use of dogs as laboratory animals. Okay. And so for years, the company, like many other medical facilities, use mammals, in this case dogs, for surgical technique training, also to train their doctors. Activists complained that these practices were unnecessary and they were cruel. And the company was plagued by a lot of insane protest demonstrations. Okay. So let me tell you how insane these were. In 1988, a bomb was placed in Leon Hirsch's parking spot by an animal rights protester. Thankfully, U.S. Surgical's company security pretty much infiltrated it and was able to prevent the bomb from doing any harm. Okay. Just insane. Like when you think about it. Now, contrary to the wishes of the animal rights protesters, U.S. Surgical's financial fortunes skyrocketed. Just skyrocketed in the early 1990s. Although the company sold only $10 million worth of laparoscopic instruments in 1987, 3 years later, the company introduced the EndoClip, which allowed laparoscopic gallbladder removal, and the market for these tools began to really grow rapidly. And I talked to my dad about this. So my dad was a general surgeon who trained at Cook County Hospital, and he was in practice from the 80s through 80s, 90s, 2000s. So he remembers all this, and this is when general surgery really started to take off. So laparoscopy was also being used for hernia operations, appendectomies, hysterectomies, and other types of abdominal surgery. So with a virtual monopoly on sales of the equipment for these operations, U.S. Surgical saw its sales grow by 50% in 1990 and 75% in the first half of 1991. Earnings during that time grew by 78%, and by the end of the year, they had nearly doubled since 1990. U.S. Surgical sold more than $300 million worth of laparoscopic instruments in 1991 to become one of the fastest growing companies in the United States with profits of $91 million. The company's stock price kept pace with a spectacular increase in business, and many of U.S. Surgical's execs who own the stocks became millionaires. Amazing. These are great American business stories. This is what I love. Hirsch predicted ample room for growth in the laparoscopic field as the technique was adapted to an even greater number of surgical tasks, and U.S. Surgical was set out to market a package of laparoscopic tools, surgical staplers, and sutures. In addition, the company began a major push to market its products in Europe, building a new sales and distribution center in France. And overall, the quarter of U.S. Surgical's revenues came from foreign sales. By 1992, 85% of all gallbladder procedures were performed using laparoscopic techniques. And at the end of that year, U.S. Surgical's revenues had topped $1 billion, of which half was contributed by laparoscopic products. The company's stupendous success with these instruments had attracted a competitor. Dun, dun, dun. Any guesses? If you guessed J&J, yep, that is the correct guess. Industry giant Johnson & Johnson, who formed Ethicon Endosurgery and vowed to introduce 40 competing products. In response to this threat and the presence of other competitors, U.S. Surgical brought suit alleging patent infringement. Okay, now let's talk about the 1990s and sort of the rounding out of our story of U.S. Surgical. So in 1990s, this is when things started to climb, and this is what happens. This is why I think in the pharmaceutical industry they're so aggressive about patent cliffs and IP cliffs, and really taking hold of a market. It's only a matter of time that when competitors start to move in, and then you start to lose market share. So in 1993, U.S. Surgical won a suit against a subsidiary of Eli Lilly and Company, in which its opponent was ordered to stop making and marketing its products. By the middle of the year, however, the company's luck had changed as its sales dropped dramatically in the face of fierce price competition from its other competitor, Ethicon. So in July 1993, U.S. Surgical reported a quarterly loss of $22 million, a switch to distribution practices to a more prompt, just-in-time delivery system caused an unexpectedly sharp fall-off in sales. And as hospitals used up the backlog of products that had stockpiled on their shelves, confident they could acquire acquire more than when they needed them. But by September 1993, U.S. Surgical was still struggling with the effects of a vast decrease in supply of its product, and stock price started to go down in a steep slide from a January 1992 high of $134 to $22.50. So that's intense. Okay. Now, anxiety over the possible effects of healthcare reform, as well as the maturation of the market for gallbladder instruments and drop off in popularity of other laparoscopic procedures, has also helped to depress U.S. Surgical sales. The company's heavy investments in manufacturing capacity, which had caused it to go into debt, this further damaged U.S. Surgical's financial results, and the company embarked upon a plan to reduce its expenditures. Now, in October 1993, U.S. Surgical announced another quarter of losses and specified cost-cutting procedures it would adopt. The company planned to lay off 80% of its workforce, cut executive pay, and reduce its stock dividend. And again, I'm mentioning this because these are the realities of how difficult it is to take a company like this to market and be successful. Okay, these are the hard decisions that have to be made. And these are the things that people don't want to talk about. Okay, so in an effort to reduce the like hemorrhaging, of all this, U.S. Surgical announced that it would shut down its factories for 2 weeks in the fall and then reopen them on a 4-day work week. This is just to reduce the cost of running those factories. Then in December 1993, company announced further cuts as financial woes continued and took a $130 million charge against its earnings to pay for its restructuring. Plus, an additional $1,600 jobs were removed from payroll. In In February 1994, they began to seek investors to infuse badly needed cash into the company. This move came after U.S. Surgical lost a suit it had brought against Ethicon for patent infringement, removing the possibility of a big cash settlement to strengthen its balance sheet. The balance sheet was, however, strengthened through the private stock offering that raised $200 million. U.S. Surgical, in the face of managed healthcare revolution, also began altering its sales tactics. So previously, it had sold products directly to surgeons, but hospitals had developed purchasing groups. Another thing we hate, purchasing groups through which they could demand large discounts. U.S. Surgical started to take more of a partnership approach as it began dealing with such groups and other cost-conscious buyers. Meanwhile, in 1993, there was more of a stock plunge that was eventually resolved through an undisclosed settlement between certain legal battles that were happening. 1995, U.S. Surgical had recovered enough to post respectable profits of $79 million on sales of $1.02 billion. The company, however, needed to find new sources of growth as its core stapling, laparoscopic, and suture products were no longer going to be the growth vehicles they once were because of continuing competition, particularly from Johnson & Johnson. Okay. U.S. Surgical therefore began seeking acquisitions to expand its product line. So in late 1995, the company spent $60 million for Surgical Dynamics, a maker of spinal cages and other devices in spinal surgery. And then in August 1996 came a $230 million hostile takeover bid for Circon Corp, a Santa Barbara-based California maker of endoscopic and sterilization equipment for urology and gynecological markets. Quick side note, if you guys want to learn more about hostile takeover, one very highly recommended piece of reading by U.S. Surgical execs and alum is the book Barbarians at the Gates. If you want to learn about hostile takeovers, definitely read that book. So the product line that they acquired would fit well in U.S. Surgical, but Circon fiercely fought to stay independent in what developed to be a protracted battle. By August 1997, U.S. Surgical gained a 14.9% stake in Circon, and in a proxy fight 2 months later, decisively won 2 seats on Circon's board. I told you, making a successful company, taking it public and everything. These aren't like sweet little unicorn stories. This is war. Now, while Circon continued to stave off a complete takeover, U.S. Surgical pursued other targets. In 97, 98, the company made several acquisitions in the area of women's healthcare, including products used for minimally invasive breast biopsy. In early 1998, U.S. Surgical acquired Pfizer's Valley Lab unit for about $425 million. Based in Boulder, Colorado, this was the maker of a surgical ultrasound system, as well as electrosurgical devices used to cut and cauterize. Now, we finally come to the end of U.S. Surgical's story, which is new life as a Tyco subsidiary. So in the consolidating late 1990s, so many of you may not remember this, but in the late 1990s, a lot of companies were getting acquired, being consolidated. I think GE was on a massive run, thanks to their CEO, who I should know. He has an MBA school. Jack Welch, there we go. Jack Welch's thing about just growing through acquisition, and so U.S. Surgical became a target for acquisition, and they agreed to be acquired by Tyco International, which is a Bermuda-based acquisitive conglomerate in May 1998. Tyco completed the acquisition in October of that year through a deal valued of about $3.2 billion in stock. And so U.S. Surgical became a subsidiary of Tyco and a part of Tyco Healthcare Group, which also included Kendall Healthcare, a maker of a wide range of disposable medical products. In anticipation of its takeover by Tyco and in light of Tyco's professed antipathy to hostile deals, U.S. Surgical terminated its tender offer for Circon. As was typical, Tyco immediately began a cost-cutting program at U.S. Surgical, which included workforce reduction, management changes, etc. And by that time, Leon Hirsch, who had reached the age of 71, would no longer head the company he founded 34 years earlier. Richard Gilliland, who was the former chairman and CEO of Kendall, was to take over. Now, I share this history for a couple reasons. One, to show what an inspiring story and person Leon Hirsch is. The little guy literally came from nothing, very, very humble background. And through his creativity, his perseverance, his grit, created a company with lasting impact. Because if we think about it, not only did they, pioneer laparoscopic surgery and minimally invasive surgery with their scopes and staplers, right? They also pioneered two really big things that are interesting. One is the razor blade business model. And the other one is this idea of hiring talented salespeople and training them clinically to educate and drive customer success with surgeons. Okay. Now, I share this history so that many of you who are not familiar with, because many of you don't stay long enough to see this kind of a history at a company, to know how absolutely brutal, how barbaric, how difficult it is to run a company like this. And a couple of, let me grab them real quick. A couple of pieces of reading that I recommend personally. This is my personal, and for me, I personally believe, if you think about it, if you think about the history of U.S. Surgical ended up losing market share to Ethicon. And a lot of the execs and the guys and gals who grew up at U.S. Surgical soon went on to Intuitive Surgical. And what did Intuitive Surgical do? Intuitive Surgical cleaned the clock of Ethicon. And so I think in some ways that was kind of like, with a robot like Intuitive coming to market, that was a lot of those salespeople's opportunity for revenge on this Ethicon endosurgery. Again, Johnson & Johnson, was a giant who essentially, took market share from U.S. Surgical and essentially put them in a position where they ended up getting acquired by Tyco. Now, if you are interested in like understanding how absolutely brutal it was in the 80s and 90s in terms of sales, in terms of business, there are three books that you need to read. The first is Barbarians at the Gate, The Fall of RJR Nabisco, which talks about hostile takeovers. The next one, Barbarians to Bureaucrats, Corporate Lifecycle Strategies by Lawrence M. Miller, which is really important. This will tell you whether you're a barbarian like me, early stage startup person, or you're a bureaucrat and you like to be at bigger companies. Great book. And the very last one, which was more of a staple at Intuitive, was Hardball by George Stock. Are you playing to play or are you playing to win? These are the kind of books that you should read to understand what does it take to develop that killer instinct in a business and just have no mercy for competitors. So with that being said, I hope you enjoyed this episode. I really enjoyed it. I wish I got a chance to meet Leon Hirsch again. If you're interested, just Google his name on YouTube. You'll see a lot of great interviews that the Mullings Group did with him. And, now that you know this, I think it's important that you share this episode with others because we have to do a better job of understanding and learning the history of our industry and where these things that we do come from. So with that being said, be sure that to subscribe to our show, give us 5 stars. We're the #1 show in the industry for a reason. That's because of you, the listener. And if you're a startup CEO and you're looking for help to grow, my company works with early stage startups in all kinds of ways to help you get commercial traction, find investors, and grow. So if you're interested, just hit me up. I'd love to hear more from you and help you out. With that being said, we'll see you all later.
Thank you for enjoying another epic episode of the State of MedTech. If you're feeling inspired and love this episode, do us a favor, hit that subscribe button and turn notifications on so you never miss an episode. And be sure to give us 5 stars and write a short review because that helps more people discover this amazing community of ours. If you're a company who has an executive that you'd like to be on the show, or perhaps you want to sponsor one of the episodes, shoot us an email at hello@khateebandco.com. Take care, and we'll see you next time.